Welcome to the Pikes Peak multi-use event. Introducing our event today will be Thayer Tutt.
Good morning, everyone. I'd like to welcome you to today's webinar celebrating just over 20 years since the publication of the Pikes Peak multi-use plan. I am Thayer Tutt, Vice Chair and Chief Investment Officer of El Pomar Foundation. And the photo our fellows decided to use today is actually a photo of me pointing at my great-grandfather who came to Colorado Springs in 1884 from Philadelphia. So thank you. El Pomar's Heritage Series program began 6 years ago as an effort to celebrate and raise awareness of our natural assets in the Pikes Peak region. We do that through convening stakeholders of all sectors to help to address issues about preservation, use, and care of our regional outdoor assets. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce the people who really put this event together and made it all happen, starting with the Heritage Series team. I'd like to recognize Walt Hecox, who you'll hear from later. He's a senior advisor of the program and a retired professor of economics at Colorado College. Of course, I can't forget the Heritage Series director, Erica Oakley-Courage, and thank her for all her leadership today and in the last couple of months. And then the four program associates or fellows at El Pomar Foundation, Claire Girardeau, Sam Hinkle, Matt Clark, and Sam Isbicki, who helped put all this together. Of course, developing the program and the focus and getting all the people to participate, along with the 125 guests we have on this webinar today, falls on two ladies. First, I'd like to thank Becky Lineweber, Executive Director of the Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance, and Susan Davies, Executive Director of Trails and Open Space Coalition. Thank you for your wonderful efforts to make all this happen. And once again, you'll hear from both of them shortly. Reflecting on the Pikes Peak multi-use plan helps us identify the key issues that our leaders were dealing with more than 20 years ago. And one of the key issues they were dealing with 20 years ago that is very important today is the importance of controlling use and preventing overuse of our trails and open space. Today, we're convening many stakeholders who are going to address these issues and many others as we try to figure out where we want to go in the community going forward. Hopefully, what we learned today will inspire all of us to come together and coordinate ideas on conservation and recreation opportunities in the Pikes Peak region. So on behalf of the Foundation, the Heritage Series program, we'd like to thank you. And I'd like to turn it over now to Karen Pallas, Director of Park, Recreation, and Cultural Services for the City of Colorado Springs. Karen, take it away.
Good morning, and thank you, Thayer. I'm so pleased to be here with you all this morning. As the Parks and Recreation and Cultural Services Director of the city, my team and I have a significant role in the operations and management of the Pikes Peak, America's Mountain. We've had the privilege of holding a special use permit with the U.S. Forest Service for the management of the Pikes Peak Highway and all visitor services along the way. We manage and operate the outdoor recreation areas of Colorado Springs utilities properties, both the north and south slopes. We own our own portion of the Bard Trail and the lower portion of the Manitou Incline. And lastly, our team has worked diligently with all partners on the Ring the Peak efforts, and most recently with reimagining the Waldo Canyon. I am so appreciative to all the organizations that have supported the Pikes Peak multi-use plan. I believe it's so important to celebrate our successes, but before we talk about those, let me share just a little bit of the history. In 1999, Colorado Springs Utilities and the U.S. Forest Service Pike San Isabel National Forest conducted a comprehensive landscape level study, Pikes Peak multi-use plan, from Colorado Springs to Cripple Creek. The study was carried out from funding from Colorado Springs Utilities, the U.S. Forest Service Pikes Peak Ranger District, and Great Outdoors Colorado. The result has been a major strategic assessment of our region's natural assets and a suggested roadmap of sorts of development guided by extensive public and stakeholder involvement. The vision of the plan, protecting the watersheds of Pikes Peak, balancing demands for utilization, preservation, and conserving the resources of the mountain. Ensuring multi-purpose access to national forests as mandated by the Forest Service resource plans, planning to provide adequate personnel and resources for maintenance, and incorporating all relevant existing plans and projects. The initial goals included determining the impact of growth on the surrounding communities of Pikes Peak, developing an environmentally based plan that established the preservation of water quality as its highest priority, developing strategies for balancing the preservation of the peak with public access and commercial use, identifying and protecting quality wildlife habitat, and stewardship programs that would encourage the public to behave in ways that would help preserve existing resources. The planning process began with a variety of stakeholders. The Citizens Advisory Group included citizens who actively used the land, like environmental groups, motorists, hikers, equestrian trail users, bikers, miners, and other interested citizens. A technical advisory group encompassed 14 resource planners tasked with defining criteria for resource maps, carrying capacity, and establishing fit between capacity and land use. Finally, there were members of the public at large that supported these efforts. These stakeholders participated in a needs assessment, a comprehensive list of needed projects, as well as an evaluation protocol to evaluate all of the projects presented. They also brainstormed alternative scenarios based upon the three primary perspectives. 1, ecological stewardship. 2, community recreation. And 3, economic development. These were then systematically synergized to create an ideal mix of all three. Finally, once priorities had been established, different models of land and resource management were considered. Each of the models, agency-led, nonprofit, conservation agency, independent, cooperative management agreements, were detailed with strengths, weaknesses, and a comparative case study from other cases of land management throughout the country. The resulting regional vision plan laid out major priorities like Ring the Peak, a visitor center on the top of Pikes Peak, and a cohesive signage system. The responsibility for carrying out these priorities were distributed amongst various groups for implementation. After 2 decades, the study continues to stand as a comprehensive roadmap of how we can sustainably manage our outdoor heritage. For instance, the Ring the Peak is nearly 80% finished. The Trails and Open Space Coalition has recently finished a study that will guide the trail completion, which draws substantially from the 1999 multi-use plan. Construction of a new visitor center on the summit at Pikes Peak, requiring a lengthy environmental assessment by the U.S. Forest Service, drew also from that multi-use plan. And I am thrilled to report that the Pikes Peak Summit Complex is scheduled to be completed in summer of 2021. So next year, we are thrilled to be able to share with you an amazing, iconic structure that will change the beautiful landscape up there, give folks the opportunity to really explore the summit in a safe and accessible way. And it's one of the things that I'm really proud of with this project. Right now, it's very challenging if you have any type of disability to maneuver along the summit. And so we're really proud that you can go all the way out to the new summit marker on an elevated platform and be able to access that. There is so much more to see and do, and if you haven't had a chance to experience the construction up there, I encourage you to do so. But we look forward from the City of Colorado Springs, Mayor Suthers, our City Council, all the folks that we look forward to celebrating that new visitor center at the Pikes Peak Summit Complex in 2021. The landscape level comprehensive plan for Pikes Peak has provided 2 decades of guidance and inspiration that remains for Pikes Peak as per inspiration that remains, lost my place a little bit there, an important part of the region's conservation heritage. Today's webinar will celebrate the multi-use plan by providing the broad overview you've just heard of the history. Our moderator and panelists will assist the work that has been completed from this plan and what is still left to be done in key sectors. And also a look ahead to see how we continue working from this plan or start the next stage of community planning to find balance between conservation and recreation. For an infographic and other resources related to the plan, please visit lpmr.org and choose Pikes Peak Heritage Series from the program menu. A link to these items will also be emailed to you next week. Well, that is a great start to our webinar today. And with that, I'd like to introduce and thank LPMR for hosting this and giving us an opportunity to participate and introduce our program associate, Claire Girardeau, who's next up on the program. Claire, take it away.
Hello, everyone. I hope you can hear me. We're just getting my video started. Karen, thank you so much for providing that really broad overview. Oops, I think my video can start. Hello, there we go. So my name is Claire. I am a fellow with LPMR Foundation. And now that we have this lovely overview, we're moving into the program and Q&A portion of our panel or in our program. We have an incredible group of panelists with us today that represent various sectors that played a role in the implementation and creation of the multi-use plan and are still really active in the conversations around recreation and conservation in the region today. Our moderator today is Becky Lineweber. She is the Executive Director of the Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance, and we have 5 panelists with us. Susan Davies is the Executive Director of the Trails and Open Space Coalition. Jeff Hovermail is the Land Special Uses and Minerals Staff Officer with the U.S. Forest Service. We have David Lineweber, the General Manager of Anglers Covey and the founder and chair of the Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance. Oscar Martinez, a District Ranger with the U.S. Forest Service. And last but certainly not least, Mark Shea, the Watershed Planning Supervisor with Colorado Springs Utilities. We asked each of our panelists today to kind of introduce themselves and talk about their connection with the Pikes Peak multi-use plan. With that, I'm going to pass it off to Becky to get things started.
Thank you, Claire. I appreciate so much you guys including us in this. Do you see my video? I don't see it showing up there yet.
We see your video.
You see it. Okay. All right. Sounds good. Well, we so appreciate being invited to participate in this celebration and discussion of the multi-use plan. It's an amazing plan. And for those of you that haven't really dived into it very deeply, we hope that today will give you an inside peek and you'll know a lot more about it. For those of you who don't know me, I am the Executive Director of PPORA, and that's short for the Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance. You can move to the next slide. Let me just share a little bit about our organization. We are a 501c3 nonprofit, and we're a collaborative of outdoor businesses, nonprofits, land managers, and government entities. And we're all working together to strengthen the outdoor recreation industry for the Pikes Peak region through leadership and collaboration. And we do that in a number of ways. Next slide, please. You can go ahead and move to the next slide. There we go. We base all of our work, which is a lot of events and programs, on these 5 pillars: grow, inspire, strengthen, steward, and advocate. And these are the goals that are around these pillars. And a lot of the things that we do, you may be familiar with in the area. We have the State of the Outdoors event, Get Outdoors Day, which we do with Colorado Parks and Wildlife, the Litter Letter Project, which is happening right now. If you go on Cimarron near I-25, you'll see big letters filled with trash. But we also launched a website, pikespeakoutdoors.org, and we're working on a lot of challenges in the area. Go ahead to the next slide, please. About 9 months ago, we really entered into what we're calling loosely our Sustainable Outdoor Recreation and Tourism Initiative. And we've been evaluating a lot of different plans and efforts, not only within the state, but outside of the state and even internationally, just to see how others are diving in on the whole topic of sustainable recreation and tourism and how they're meeting some of the challenges that they're dealing with, which are very similar to what we're dealing with in this area. We're hoping some of that work will help inform what we do here in the Pikes Peak region. So we're really leaning in and trying to figure out some of this and come up with some solutions collaboratively. And that's where the multi-use plan comes in. You can go ahead and go to the next slide. This is an amazing plan. And if you haven't, like I said, if you haven't dived into it, I know it's over 200 pages. It's a lot, but you can skim through it. You can find the highlights. And today we're going to talk about it. But I just want to celebrate how our community has this wonderful tradition of coming together. We come together, we work on the big issues, we dream big dreams, and then we put those things into action. And that's really what this multi-use plan is all about. So I'm excited that you're here with us. We're going to hear a lot of different perspectives from our panelists, which is awesome. And we're going to have them introduce themselves to kick this off. So let's start first with Susan Davies with the Trails and Open Space Coalition. Susan?
Becky, thank you so very much. And it's just great to be part of this conversation. So as many of you know, the Ring the Peak idea, the trail, is very, very old. And my organization, the Trails and Open Space Coalition, since it was formed in the 80s, has been all about trail connectivity. So it was so important for us to support those who are working on it and then at some point take the lead on this whole project. Quite frankly, this idea has been around for something like 50 years. What would it be like to create a trail that circumnavigates the peak? And during the multi-use plan, it was discussed extensively as the Perimeter Loop Trail, and certainly something that everybody got excited about. So a little background about that. Friends of the Peak began securing agreements with the Forest Service, using existing trail, forest roads, and completing key connections so that 63 miles of that trail were completed. And take a look at the map. You can see that we now have two gaps that continue. We have, you can go back, El Paso County is addressing the northeast gap, and that's over, as you see, the Northeast Trail Corridor. And if they can get some funding, it should be completed, say, within the next 3 to 5 years. We, as an organization, with many, many partners, are addressing that southwest gap, which looks deceptive. It originally was going to be about 8 miles to complete with some of our original alignments. Now it's closer to 24, so it's going to take a little while. But nonetheless, with great support from partners, it can be done. So let's take you back to 2017, or even earlier, when the governor at the time declared this as a primary project. 16 and 16, he called it, and we were very excited to be one of the 16 trails he wanted to see addressed and completed. So we secured a Great Outdoors Colorado grant in 2017 for some serious planning. Got help, of course, from City of Colorado Springs, a key partner in this, as well as some help from the Anschutz Foundation. And that resulted in a master plan that was completed in 2019, which I know many of you listening participated, and for that we're so very grateful. Now, since then, we have then looked at the various segments you see in red down there, and we're working with key partners to start addressing those. And they all have different areas of challenge and need different expertise to complete. The Forest Service is going to be key to completing our segment 1 and segment 4, where we're going to need the appropriate environmental permissions to get that accomplished. Newmont Mine is going to be providing easements, we hope, in segment 2. And then CDOT and Teller County will be helping us with concerns along Gold Camp Road to complete segment 3. And plus, of course, we're talking with representatives from Cripple Creek and Victor about that community connection, which was not part of the original plan, but is so appropriate to address in this overall plan because it will connect those communities to the Ring the Peak Trail project, bringing economic growth to those areas. Now, the challenges that we have, of course, are expected. We've had delays caused by COVID. We had a change in management at Newmont Mine. And now we are re-examining our segment 1 because it is very clear that we're going to need to get some work done on the trail leading up to Pancake Rocks before we can go over this other side and begin really building new trail to address the gap with Ring the Peak. But we have some great successes to report as well. We now have Samantha Gooch, who's with the U.S. Forest Service, the recreation planner, and she has told us that this trail is a priority for her, and so she's working closely with us to start getting the wheel moving. And we also have wonderful support from local partners that are very supportive of the trail. Finally, Palmer Land Trust, now a partner, and is hiring someone who's going to address some of those trail easements that we're going to need to complete the trail. So that's very, very exciting. And then, of course, there are opportunities like this one to talk to you, keep you engaged, keep you excited about completing this really critical trail. So our next steps really are to stay the course, to keep talking to key partners and stakeholders. Our goal would be to get a portion of trail underway and get some construction going in 2021. And keep you all very much engaged in this process, because we can't wait until this trail is finished, and one more reason that all of us love to live in this region. Becky?
Thanks, Susan. Thank you so much for that overview, and we look forward to hearing a little bit more about that later in the program. Our next person up is Jeff Hovermail. Jeff, will you please share with us your perspective from the Forest Service?
Good morning, friends, and certainly our extended appreciation to Thayer Tutt and Walt Peacock and the entire Heritage Series staff. And also, as you conclude, be it Walt or the staff, please walk all the participants through perhaps the next progression in the Heritage Series and how this webinar will weave into the overall fabric of this community as we strive toward greater conservation and meeting the community needs. I wish I were in person, we were all together. My best to all the participants today. I hope you're all well, and many of you have worked with all of our agencies toward achieving goals, in part rooted in the Pikes Peak Multi-Use Plan. So just know that I continue to be here. This is my 24th year here with the Pikes Peak Ranger District, and I wear green. My role relative to the multi-use plan planning area is I'm involved in lands and special uses. So I administer the Pikes Peak Highway and Recreation Corridor permit, and then many of the associated non-recreation infrastructure within that landscape. So very closely align and coordinate with Colorado Springs Utilities for some of the water storage components and other infrastructure in the landscape. And then a lot of this tears back to the reserve of the National Forest. So the Pikes Peak Timber Reserve, established in 1892, really was founded to preserve and conserve the watersheds of the greater Pikes Peak region. And then that, of course, evolved in 1913 to establish the municipal watershed agreements with Forest Service, the cities of Manitou Springs and Colorado Springs. And that's where our relationship was born to. And here we are over a century later. And this plan, the multi-use plan specifically, brought us together with more cohesion to align our mission relative to the ecological and recreational values within this landscape. And so all the participants today, we operate in strength in numbers, and many of you have contributed to this plan, as well as continue to support many of the areas, organizations and partners that help us achieve these goals. Just as Susan mentioned, the progression of the Palmer Land Trust, and we've certainly all been enriched with the involvement of Jennifer Peterson and Rocky Mountain Field Institute and the work that they've done to achieve. Some of the original founders of Friends of the Peak, Mary Berger being one, continue to support and provide resources to achieving our objectives. And then there are certainly new organizations that have evolved, Friends of the Incline Group, and then of course Becky and David now with Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance. So that just helps bring us all together. I'll yield now to Becky for our next presenter, and I'll try to reduce any time I have on the panel. I really want to afford time for the question and answer period so I can engage and we can all listen and learn. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Jeff. Yeah, we're all looking forward to getting to those questions that the audience has posed to us. So we'll do that just shortly, but thank you so much for your introduction. David Lineweber, and you might notice we have the same last name. This is my husband, so I'm introducing David now. So please share with us a little bit about yourself and your connection to the multi-use plan.
All right. Well, as many of you know, Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance is an organization that me and my wife helped start, and I'm really excited about kind of where we're at with all that. Go ahead and advance the slide. And the whole goal of the organization is to really kind of engage with the community and kind of highlight all the different aspects. My particular role for this discussion is really to look at the economic piece. And so I wanted to kind of give you all a little perspective really quick going into this about how did the plan get involved with it and where are we at right now. So let's take, for example, go ahead and advance, the space industry. We've been talking about Space Command and all that in our community for quite a bit. And it's a big deal. I mean, getting Space Command to come here temporarily is big. If we can get it permanently, even better. But it's a $158 billion GDP, gross domestic product. That's how much it contributes to our economy nationally, $158 billion. Go ahead and advance the slide. Outdoor recreation. Oh, that's true. So we've made all these investments in our infrastructure, our roads, our education, our quality of life stuff to get this. Outdoor recreation is a $427 billion GDP, and consumers in 2017 spent $887 billion on outdoor recreation. 887. Yeah. Anyway, so it's 3 times larger than Space Command. Think about that. I mean, put that into your, kind of thought process when you think about these things. Okay, go ahead, advance slide. So, outdoor recreation is kind of unique as an industry because it does, it has its own economic value in and of itself. But outdoor recreation also brings kind of some other components that other industries don't necessarily do. They bring the quality of life value, which draws people here to take on those tech jobs or those whatever jobs they might be. New employees are looking for more than just a paycheck. They want to live in a beautiful, great spot, and we have all that. And then also the health and well-being value of being in the outdoors has proven to just be better for all of our health. And so outdoor recreation collides with almost every industry and every aspect of our community, which I think is really important when you think about that. Go ahead and advance. So how does the Pikes Peak region compete in the outdoor recreation industry? How do we compete against other places? Well, we're going to have to do a couple of things. We need to go ahead and advance and just kind of flow through. We need to identify what our challenges are. We need to identify what our opportunities are. We need to engage in the entrepreneurship of the private sector. We need to invest in infrastructure, and we need to identify funding. We need to be sustainable and inclusive. And, we need to come together as a community. You know what we need? We need a plan. And we actually have one. I mean, this plan was put together 20 years ago, and it was pretty well done for the time. And we need to kind of continue the progress of this plan, update it, and bring some other things, because there was some successes. Go ahead and it was created in 1999, as we discussed, and there's been some great accomplishments. Ring the Peak Trail is getting closer. South Slope Recreation Area, the Summit House, Devil Playground. We've got some things really coming together over the last 20 years. But we do have challenges, and I think we're all kind of recognizing that. We have a lot of people, lot of people engaging in the outdoors, particularly with our time during COVID. And it is downright depressing at times. You have to scratch your head about, what in the heck is going on. And we're actually kind of being overwhelmed. And so we've got to address those challenges. But we also need to kind of focus on the fact that we have opportunity. Go ahead, Vance. There's great opportunities. There's amazing opportunities. We have America's mountain, and there's so many things I think that are possible. We just got to come together and find out how to kind of spur those things on. So I'm really excited about our conversation here, and I'd like to invite everyone to get involved now. We're looking at how do we accomplish these things. So Becky, I'm going to turn it back over to you, and I'm excited about what we're talking about today.
All right, thank you, David. And our next speaker is going to be Oscar Martinez with the U.S. Forest Service. Oscar, take it away.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's a pleasure to be here with a whole host of folks that have been partners, both from the genesis of the multi-use plan, but more importantly, partners that we continue to interact with on a daily basis. So I'm just honored to be here with those folks to begin with. Thank you for all the effort in setting this up and getting it set up so that we can have these kinds of conversations. I think these are critical and important. Certainly, as most of you that are familiar with the U.S. Forest Service, you know that we've been in the recreation business, if you would, and in the multiple use business for a long time, since our genesis, basically. But things don't stay the same. Things evolve, things continue to change, and how we interact with our partners, how we interact with our neighbors also changes as a function of how the things around us continue to evolve and change. So my contributions to the discussions today is to kind of give you the federal land manager perspective on how we fit together with all the partners that you've been listening to. We've done enough of these and we've worked together enough with the partners that I almost knew exactly what the folks were going to bring to the table in terms of what we were going to see, which is why you're not seeing a lot of slides from me. But everything that's been shared to date, I would echo both the challenges and the opportunities and the benefits of having gone through the process as an agency that's together with our neighbors and partners to figure out how we look at this landscape. So what do I find interesting and unique about the multi-use plan? Well, I would say it's one of the earliest examples here locally where you got different agencies, different partners sitting down at the table and taking a holistic landscape view of how we try to integrate both the uses and try to integrate our missions, I would say, and those uses that folks want to gain or derive from those public lands. But how do we strike that balance? So I think the multi-use plan was an excellent effort at trying to find that balance, trying to strike that balance. As a byproduct of that, I think there were some excellent opportunities that were identified that that are being pursued. As you've heard already, we've been successful with most of them. Some still remain, but we're kind of closing in on those and trying to get those done. Some were more complex than others, and so that's kind of what you're seeing is we got some of the easy work done up front. We're having to work on some of the harder ones here towards the end, but the end result is we're getting it done. So what are the other benefits that I see from the multi-use plan as a district ranger for the U.S. Forest Service? Well, the unseen part of the multi-use plan that I interact with and my staff interact with, and you certainly have already heard from Jeff, and you heard Samantha's name already earlier today from Susan's discussion, is the concept and the idea of how we interact with our neighbors. That created a synergy that has translated to work above and beyond just on the goals and elements around the multi-use plan. For example, if you think back to 3 or 4 or 5 years ago when the Bear Creek fish population was discovered to have some unique genetics in Bear Creek, because of those existing relationships, the process we went through to get to a final decision was essentially building a roundtable very similar to the multi-use plan and bringing folks together with a whole spectrum of folks with different ideas on how we should do it and different thoughts about it. But all the land managers and all the public participation allowed us, I think, to move through that process efficiently so that when we made a final decision, it was something that we could all live with and accept as something we needed to do. So that's a recent example of things that are still going on. The other one that I think is probably, and I think Mark Shea will touch on this, is on the as a side conversation between the Forest Service and in this case Colorado Springs Utilities. It has spun off, if you would, other agreements between the two partners to go and do work, additional work, and this is vegetation work that benefits both forest health and watershed health across a broader chunk of that landscape. So I think my feedback in terms of what it's meant for us is that it's created a culture where all the participating landowners, all the folks that are involved and interested in public land management have a forum to be able to sit down, talk about things together. It's not to say that the problems we're working on are easy or that we have a ready solution in our pocket when we get together. But what it's allowed us to do is kind of come to the table with whatever resources, ideas, and abilities to work together to kind of find those solutions. So I think that's one of those lasting legacies of the multi-use plan, above and beyond all the projects we identified that we agreed we needed to pursue. So with that, that's my contribution. I look forward to the question and answers, and I'm going to transition it back to Becky so she can help us move on to the next candidate or the next speaker.
Thank you, Oscar. I appreciate that. And I have to agree wholeheartedly. I think one of the greatest things that did come out of the multi-use plan is the collaborations and the working with multiple partners with different perspectives. And I just want to say on this panel, obviously we couldn't have a huge panel, but there certainly are other parts of this plan that are not represented here specifically on the panel, but all those voices are important to us. And I think you're going to hear those perspectives through the discussion today. And to our next panelist, Mark Shea from the Colorado Springs Utilities. Please introduce yourself.
Thank you, Becky. Good morning, everyone. Again, I'm Mark Shea. I'm the Watershed Planning Supervisor with Colorado Springs Utilities Water Resources Management Department. Go ahead and if you'd start my slides, please. Again, just an introduction of myself and who I represent, and a nice little picture of Wilson Reservoir up in the upper reaches of the South Slope watershed. Go ahead and move on to the next slide, please. So Colorado Springs Utilities is the primary water provider in the Pikes Peak region. And so I want to take a moment to kind of back up and reintroduce the landscape from a water supply perspective, because this was a driving factor in Colorado Springs Utilities' involvement in the development of the Pikes Peak multi-use plan. So starting with the map on the left, I want to walk you through the North Slope water system, which includes both North and South Catamount Reservoir and Crystal Reservoirs. This system is a primary source of water service to communities in the UPass area and provides critical water storage and conveyance of our Blue River water, which we import from Summit County. Water from the North Slope system can be conveyed over to the Northfield system, which is depicted in the map in the upper right-hand corner of the slide. This includes Rampart, Nichols, and Northfield Reservoir. Now, while this part of our system is just outside of the Pikes Peak multi-use plan geographic scope, the Northfield system presents similar opportunities for recreation within the region and some of the same challenges that we'll be discussing today. The bottom right map shows Utilities' South Slope system. That brings water from the Beaver Creek drainage over into Ruxton Creek. Encompassing the area historically referred to as the Seven Lakes, the South Slope system was the city's first trans-basin system, importing additional water supplies into the Fountain Creek watershed to serve our growing community back in the late 1800s. Between the local Pikes Peak sources of water and the Blue River water supply that's conveyed through the North Slope reservoirs, the North and South Slope systems account for roughly a quarter of our community's water supply. Next slide, please. Reflecting the importance of these areas of Pikes Peak and meeting our community's water supply needs, starting in the late 1800s, the city began acquiring significant land holdings in the region to support development of our local water systems. The parcels outlined in red on this map were purchased around 1908 to support the development of the North Slope water system. You'll note we have Long's Ranch down on the right-hand end of that map, and then also the North Slope recreation area in the upper part of that map. Next slide, please. To the south, properties were acquired by the city around the turn of the century, primarily through congressional land grants. So property that was actually deeded over to the city specifically for the purposes of developing and protecting our municipal water supply. Jeff Hovermel mentioned this in his discussion earlier. But in addition to the properties that were actually granted to the city or acquired by the city, vast portions of the Pike National Forest in the Pikes Peak region are also subject to congressional reservations and cooperative agreements that the city of Colorado Springs has with the United States Forest Service to protect municipal water supply values. Of note, I'll point out that several years back, the city conveyed the Jones Park property that's shown in the middle of the slide here to El Paso County. So that's no longer city-owned property. Next slide, please. So this background highlights one of utilities' primary roles of providing sustainable, high-quality water service to our community. As the beneficiary of congressional grants and reserves on Pike National Forest and the owner of watershed lands on the Peak, Utilities is a primary land and natural resources manager in the region. And our leadership role in developing the plan reflected our need to partner with other regional stakeholders to responsibly accommodate recreation on Pikes Peak. For Utilities, several benefits of the plan include that it recognizes important fundamental issues, specifically the protection of our community's water supply watersheds, in establishing the plan's vision. Also, the plan recognizes the need for ongoing regional support to sustainably manage various land uses in this region. Final slide, please. So a couple of ways the plan has guided utilities in our work. First, it served as a cornerstone and the foundation of how we continue to plan for the management of recreational access on our municipal watersheds. It introduced the concept of carrying capacity, which helps us recognize that there are limits to the amount of access and use that can be sustainably accommodated on any given landscape, and that this is significantly affected by resources available for managing and maintaining those uses. While the plan establishes that different agencies are responsible for implementing and maintaining projects in their respective jurisdictions, Utilities is built on this to develop agreements with partner agencies like the U.S. Forest Service and organizations to help us accommodate and manage recreation on and around our municipal watersheds. And finally, the plan supported Utilities' own development of a guidance document for recreational uses on our municipal watershed lands, which cleared the path for opening the Pikes Peak South Slope watershed for public recreation. So I look forward to continuing this discussion with the panel and the participants and provide perspective on the plan and recreation in the region going forward. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Mark. We appreciate that and understanding CSU's connection to the plan much better. And we're going to hear more from you as the panel questions start up here shortly. So as we transition and get to the panel, I wanted to just reiterate that you received an overview from Karen earlier, which was fantastic. Appreciate that. And she mentioned there's an infographic. There's also some slides that have been put together, some information for you, and you can go to El Pomar's website. Hopefully we'll put the link, we'll try to put the link in the chat for all of you so that you can see where to go to get that additional information. But I think that'll help you to have a little bit more context for this as you think about it following our time here together. I don't know about you, but it is easy for me to forget what happened 21 years ago. That was a long time ago. Time moves pretty quickly. And our plan was initiated in 1999. The world was a very different place at that time. Our city, certainly Pikes Peak itself, so many changes have taken place. And we're going to address some of those as we go. But one of the values I think to this panel is we have somebody here who was participating with us through this multi-use process, who was here at the time. And so we're going to start our questions with you, Jeff. Jeff Hovermel, as he mentioned, was here and participated in the multi-use plan back 20 plus years ago. So Jeff, can you tell us from your perspective, in your role with the Forest Service, what are you most proud of from the plan? You know, what do you think is noteworthy and should be highlighted from the plan, particularly from the land use conservation standpoint?
Oh, thank you, Becky. Many of you and our panelists have captured the essence of this plan and how we move forward. So the past is always informative. and instructive to us as we move forward with our present day challenges. I might add though, Eric Howe continues with Colorado Springs Utilities, very closely working with Mark Shea, and Jack Glavin, continues as the manager of Pikes Peak Highway. Both Jack and Eric participated in this planning effort as well. And so we still retain that institutional memory. I think, Becky, what is most informative was after the North Slope collaboratively opened up with Springs Utilities, with City Parks Management in the early to mid 90s, the Forest Service and our surrounding partners never had a true collaborative planning effort. And it was the vision and the resources we brought together to establish the multi-use plan. And that was the first or early true collaborative planning effort in the greater Pikes Peak region. And I think that really set the model for how we all operate today, whether it's most recently reimagining Waldo and the Ring the Peak gap analysis, and there are other endeavors such as the Bear Creek watershed. But it was our first conversation with the greater community, and our relationships continue to be strengthened from that. So with that in mind, I'll yield back my time. And I do appreciate Walt and the team providing or will provide a link to the multi-use plan. Becky, keep in mind, we don't even have an electronic copy of the Pikes Peak multi-use plan. The Forest Service in 1996 and 1997, when we initiated this project, we didn't have internet. We didn't have IBM computers at that time. So you think of how we've grown, the data that we have now versus in 1999 using ArcGIS, ArcMap. We're so much richer in what we have now to build on the core of that plan. So I really appreciate you sharing the link with the participants, and us as an agency. We'll now be able to retain and download an electronic copy of the plan. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks so much, Jeff. It was a challenge initially to find the plan, but yeah, there's a PDF of it, and the mapping. I mean, you're right. Technology has changed so much, but the mapping that was done at that time is impressive for what was available then. So thank you for that. And yes, that link is put into the chat. So now that the audience has access to that. Appreciate your standpoint from, one of the great things was the start of that kind of collaboration of the Forest Service with the many partners with the multi-use plan, and examples of how that has continued today. And for those of you who don't know, it doesn't happen everywhere. It really doesn't. And so it's great that this was our first step, I guess, 21 years ago for this community to work collaboratively like that. So next question is to Mark. Mark, we realize you weren't here personally involved in the creation of the plan, although I appreciate knowing about Eric Howe and Jack Glavin. So yes, there's still definitely some institutional knowledge for those who are still involved. But Mark, what do you think from Colorado Springs Utilities perspective? Your organization took a lead role in commissioning this. And as an entity whose primary focus is protecting the community's drinking water, why did CSU take that lead role? And can you tell us what CSU properties were addressed in the plan and some projects completed as a result of the plan? We heard a little bit about that, but we'd love to hear it from your perspective.
Sure, thank you, Becky. Yeah, so back in the 90s, things were changing as they continue to do. But there was a recognition from utilities perspective that greater demand for access and recreation on our public lands in the Pikes Peak region was a factor in how we would manage this landscape. And the protection of our community's water supply and system infrastructure was essential from utilities perspective. We'd invested so much in the development of our local water supply and the Pikes Peak water systems that we needed to make sure that those would be protected in a sustainable way. And we knew that this would need to be done through a partnership with other agencies and stakeholders within the region. So the maps I showed before kind of laid out the primary properties that were addressed. And at the time, the South Slope watershed area was still closed. The Northfield system, including Rampart and Nichols and Northfield, was not included. So it was primarily the North Slope recreation area with North and South Catamount, Crystal Reservoir, and then down through the Ute Pass area, including Long's Ranch. And so we knew that the sustainable management of the resources in that land, again, needed to be subject of stakeholder process input and partnerships with other agencies in the region. And so we knew that we needed to be at the table to move that planning process forward. And we're proud that we were able to partner with U.S. Forest Service in leading the development of the plan.
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate that. Yeah, and as somebody who enjoys recreation on the North Slope, good job. And then after that, South Slope recreation was developed as well. So appreciate that and understanding kind of the history of how Colorado Springs Utilities came to participate in this and to be a leading voice and instrumental in getting this plan done. So thank you for that. Next, I want to go over to Susan. We're going to talk about a little bit more in depth, Ring the Peak. So one of the terrific things that came out of this multi-use plan from a recreational standpoint is Ring the Peak Trail project, or at the time it was Perimeter Trail. Susan, tell us a bit about that. Where is the project completion standing today, and what is needed to complete the ring? Where do we stand? You gave us a little bit of an overview, but if you want to dive in and give us just some more details, this is something I know that our community is very interested in for a number of reasons. And it seems like we keep getting close. We make some progress, and then we just can't quite get it over the line. So help us understand where we're at.
So Becky, thanks for that. It's kind of 2 steps forward and 1 step back. As I alluded to before, when we started the planning process, we had created some alignments. We're hoping to address something like a 7 or 8 mile gap, and now it's 24. And that does not include the community loop that connects Cripple Creek and Victor. But the reality is, when we went through that planning process and brought all those stakeholders together, it became pretty clear that the 24-mile alignment was really the way we were going to accomplish this at this time. Maybe down the road there'll be other options, but at this point, given the concerns about the bighorn sheep population, concerns about watershed, we heard from Mark about how important the peak is to the safety of our water supply. And that's not just true for, obviously, Colorado Springs, but for Victor and Cripple Creek and many other communities. So all of that taken into consideration, the plan is much more substantive and more difficult to accomplish than we thought when we started, but that doesn't mean it's any less important. So to get this done, it's going to require the passion of those who care about this plan, coordination with the various partners and agencies. And one of the big factors is going to be to develop a management plan. So one of the things we're going to have to work out is, when someone is using the trail and is hurt, who's going to get called? Because, there's not cell phone service in some of those parts. If someone, violates a fence or goes onto private property, who's going to handle that? So there's, and how is it going to be monetized? How are we going to make sure that it remains maintained and well signed and all those things? Now we have some ideas, and some ideas are spelled out in the plan. And please, I would encourage you to check out the plan because it's a great document. But nonetheless, they have to be worked out. So there are challenges ahead, but the Trails and Open Space Coalition, partnering with the Forest Service, the City of Colorado Springs, Palmer Land Trust, Friends of the Peak, a host of other partners. I truly believe we can get this done, but it will require some perseverance and patience on everyone's part. Becky?
All right, thanks, Susan. Appreciate that. You know, when we look at the plan and we think about the pieces of land management you brought up, Susan, recreational elements, conservation, there could be some gaps. You know, what are some things that haven't been covered? And so, Jeff, we're going to throw this question over to you from the Forest Service. And as you think back to the plan in 1999, and where we are today, are there aspects of land management, recreation, and or conservation that aren't covered or you don't think are covered sufficiently in this plan? And if so, what expansion would you propose today? So a look back and a thinking about going forward.
Oh, you just love sharing broad questions, Miss Becky. Thank you. Let's also keep in mind the plan is a quality collaborative document, and it outlines futuring for recreation and conservation opportunities. But as with any plan, since 1999, the landscape isn't static. And so a plan has to always keep in mind how it can be leveraged through adaptive management. So think, since 1999, we have 9/11, and that's when Springs Utilities and the entire community and across the country, we reevaluated safety and security. 2002, the Hayman Fire, no longer the largest wildland fire in Colorado as of the last week or so. Waldo Canyon Fire was a changing event. Obviously, discovery or rediscovery of a genetically pure greenback cutthroat trout from the South Platte watershed in the greater Bear Creek area. So as we walk through time, there have been many changes that a plan can't foresee, but that needs to adapt to. I'll just slip in a PSA to everyone. We treasure the greater Pikes Peak region and its resources. But from the National Forest Service perspective, we also manage them for all people. And so the beauty of Pikes Peak and why Karen Pallas and the mayor are so excited with the Pikes Peak Summit Complex is that attracts an international visitor. And it's an opportunity for individuals from all over the world to experience the gems of Pikes Peak, and certainly a tundra high elevation 14er, which is very unique to be able to access via automobile, of course, cog railway, and now two system trails. The plan, one area, Pikes Peak itself, above the 14,000 foot contour, as you're all aware of, it is a National Historic Landmark. So we partner with the with National Park Service to meet those objectives, to care for that landscape as a National Historic Landmark. And there was barely a mention in the plan relative to Pikes Peak proper as a National Historic Landmark, and we want to value that. And the Pikes Peak Summit Complex finally will afford our community to restore the integrity of that landscape. The plan also has a section on cultural resources. I think Oscar and others will discuss our relationships with Native American tribes, but through our formal consultation process with the Pikes Peak Summit Complex project, we engaged with over 19 tribes, 4 tribes of which have chosen to participate to realign their tribal perspectives with how we move forward in management of Pikes Peak, both Pikes Peak Massive and the summit itself. So we're very excited. It's something we didn't foresee in the multi-use plan, because the multi-use plan, while it's wonderful strategic forward thinking with vision, it doesn't incorporate our environmental analysis under the National Environmental Policy Act. So individually, each project has been evaluated following our NEPA and consultation parameters, and we've had wonderful success stories. One item that the plan focused on outside of recreation really is conservation, and both Mark and Oscar have noted our cooperative agreements and efforts to treat thousands of acres toward a healthier forest throughout the greater North Slope and South Slope areas and other areas throughout the Pikes Peak region. But that benefit is really we're beginning to see the ecological services that are returning to that landscape. But that all goes back to about 1996 and 97. Another note of history, Becky and friends, was annually Colorado Springs Utilities hosts what they call their annual water system tour between Colorado Springs and Homestake Reservoir. And they invite elected officials, other area organizations, as well as citizens that have participated in those tours over the years. And in the mid-90s, it was the first time when a Forest Service representative and Colorado Springs representative, while we're at Crystal Reservoir looking out throughout the beauty of the landscape, began to initiate a dialogue on watershed management and conserving and protecting and building resiliency into the landscape. And so while the multi-use plan focuses on an interdisciplinary and an array of projects to support the community, I, from the Forest Service perspective, can't emphasize the conservation element of this plan and how we continue to build upon those successes. And thank you for the opportunity, Becky, and back to you.
Thank you, Jeff. I appreciate that. And yes, a couple of things that you brought out in that I want to point out here, and that is, when we're looking at this multi-use plan, it's easy to look back and be, Monday morning quarterbacking and go, well, we missed the mark on this, but we can't expect this particular plan to be a be-all and end-all. It wasn't intended to be that. And that our purpose here is not to point out all the things that, could have been or should have been a part of it. But one of the things that you shared that I think we're going to hear a little bit more about is that the plan needs to remain flexible because things change. And if you go into the plan, you'll read there were some scenarios, some futuring scenarios where the people that were involved in the plan were looking at the future, and it's interesting to go back and hear about some of that, because we're looking backwards, but the folks then were looking forward to an imagined future. And certainly some of those things have come to pass, but a lot of things are different today. And we need to be able to be flexible and change. The other piece that you brought up there, Jeff, with the balance of recreation and conservation and economic values, I think all of those are so key and need to work interrelatedly. And they do in the plan, and I think we're going to hear a little bit more about that in just a moment. Before we move to our next speaker, I did want to mention we will hopefully have some Q&A time for those of you having questions right now. Maybe you didn't send us your questions beforehand. If you do have questions, you can put them in the chat, or you can email to El Pomar. I don't have that exact email address, so if El Pomar Fellows, if you would put that in the chat so people know where to direct their questions. But hopefully we'll have some time for some of those after we go through the panel questions that we already have. All right, turning our attention now, one of those three items that I mentioned was an economic perspective. And, David Lineweber, you're a business owner, and you serve on the executive team of the State Outdoor Recreation Industry Office. And as you look at the plan from an economic development perspective, are there aspects missing from this original plan that you would like to see incorporated or expanded on in the future? We're in a different place today than we were when this was initiated. So share with us your perspective.
Well, we are in a very kind of a different place today for certain. The plan, although it discusses a little bit about economic development, it does it kind of in a pretty modest way. I mean, for example, of the over 200 pages of thought, there's only 3 times that it uses the word business in the entire context. In passing, it mentions the 5-year economic depression during the Y2K bug, it also talks about actually the need for public land to spur economic growth, but it doesn't really go much beyond that. And there's really a difference. There's a change that's kind of taken place. Consumers today are really seeking unique adventure and experiences. And as I mentioned earlier, 3 years ago, they spent over $887 billion annually. And during this pandemic, I know that number is even bigger. This plan doesn't fully address creating opportunities to capture those dollars, or an idea of how do we compete in the outdoor marketplace, because we are competing. I mean, there's a lot of communities that are seeing outdoor recreation as vital to their future. I give you one example. In the Grand Valley area, Grand Junction Palisade, they've been working for 10 years on a new trail called the Palisade Plunge. And I'm going to kind of put a link in there for people kind of interested. It's a mountain bike trail, 32 miles long. It goes from the top of Grand Mesa down to the Palisade Valley. And they're expecting a return of $5 million annually to the local economy for this one trail, which is really kind of big. And then locally, you also have to realize in this plan, this is pre-incline. So the Manitou Incline actually is not even mentioned in the plan. Because of the pandemic, we're getting a new perspective that I just actually heard about last week, that people are being required to register for the incline, and they're being required to give their zip code. And the result of that is we're able to gather some data, and over half of the people using the incline are from out of the area. And a significant amount of those are from out of state. And so the incline itself is bringing economic impact or dollars to our community. And the plan doesn't really grab that per se. We just finished, Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation just finished the Apex race, which is turning out to be one of the largest mountain bike races this year. And it was a huge success for our first one. And there's going to be an analysis on kind of what the economic return on that is. But overall, I think if I was to phrase it kind of key, I think the key factor that needs to be addressed is a way to foster a culture of entrepreneurship. How do we create or give businesses opportunities to kind of leverage our our resources in a way that they can develop economic benefit to our community? So I think that's kind of a big part. The other part I want to talk about that I think is kind of significant is the plan didn't talk about this. Cell phones are commonplace now, but back then the word technology is not even really used in the entire plan. And there's so much that's going on with this device that I don't even think we can imagine what the future is going to be. One thing, to keep in mind, Google Maps is currently looking into ways of measuring trail use. They can identify how many people are on a trail, and they can then post that. So you can look and go, wow, I'm not going to go to Bar Trail today, because you can see the amount of traffic that's actually on the trail. There's other technology that's measuring how full parking lots are. And so this gives an opportunity to kind of share with the public, wow, that's a busy area. Maybe I'll go over here instead. And that kind of will help us kind of manage where, people can kind of go and travel. I have to kind of preface all this economic growth with a strong belief that there has to be balance. I can talk about economic development all the time, but I want to make sure that I emphasize that it has to be matched with sustainability. Because if we lose or diminish our resources in a way that is destructive by overuse or a variety of other things, fire may be one of them, it could greatly impact our businesses. And so we have to kind of do this in a responsible way. We don't want to jeopardize our resource and have a negative outdoor business outcome. So I think that's kind of the key components that I would kind of add to the plan. I think that are kind of missing, and I'm kind of excited about what we might do in the future.
Thank you, David. Yeah, I often talk about that as an outdoor business who relies on fishing, if we don't have fish in the stream, if we don't have access to trails and streams to get those fish, we don't have a business. So conservation is very much a part of everything that we do. As we move forward, I'm going to give a really loaded question to Oscar because there's so much happening right now. But as we look at the 20-year-old multi-use plan, we also need to share with the audience that our forest plan is from 1984, and it is the oldest in Region 2. A lot has changed from 20 and 30 years ago, some of which was already addressed. By the way, for those of you who don't know what Y2K was, you're younger than that. It was a big scare for us. We didn't know what was going to happen when we moved over to the year 2000, and that was actually addressed in this plan. And technology, as David said, has really changed. And as you mentioned, Jeff, Pikes Peak, the national status of Pikes Peak, America's mountain, wasn't as highly valued, and the relationship with the National Park Service in the plan. But now that we're moving forward into looking at the future, we've got to look at today. And as our district manager, boy, Oscar, you're seeing some of the challenges that we're experiencing: increased usage pressure because of growth, corresponding changes in ethics, the impacts of climate change, particularly wildfires, and we're going to have a question on that at the end. But what changes would you make to the plans as you look to the future to maybe incorporate some things that address these challenges? Or do you feel like those things were addressed in this plan?
Well, thanks for the handoff there, Becky. A plan that's 36 years old. I mean, we're talking about the multi-use plan, which is 20 years old. The forest plan is 36 plus years, and probably the planning that predates is probably another 10 years ahead of that. So things change. So there's both things that change and things that don't change. So here's a couple of things. So the forest plan is 36 years old. We've got, I think, to try to keep things going and try to adjust and adapt. We've got like 34 amendments to the forest plan to try to keep up with that scale of change. However, as we already talked about the multi-use plan, you can't capture all the things. You don't know what you don't know. And to the example that David used earlier, like the cell phone and how that's changing the way people interact with their environment and how that changes how people share information. So in terms of the things that haven't changed, there has been, at least in the greater Pikes Peak area, and think back to, I think it was the 1920s that the first campground, this is literally the first national campground, was actually established just down the road in the San Isabel on Davenport. And so this idea of people wanting to interact with the forest and their public lands has always been there. And certainly the genesis and the discussions that Mark shared in terms of the watershed and those early agreements to the 1930s or 1913 and even earlier, the basic genesis for the Forest Service was to protect watersheds. Those things haven't changed. So I think the natural resources that we manage, and then therefore the love that folks have for those, or the desire to access those, that hasn't changed. So what has changed? So the things that have changed significantly for us is, and I was having this discussion with David earlier offline, is increasingly the National forests that, or I would say most public lands, are becoming islands unto themselves, where the demands outside of us are starting to drive what happens in the interior. So the new forest plans will have to take that into consideration. So for us locally, it would allow us to refocus perhaps how we consider management areas. So management areas are the ways that the forest is broken up into these logical management blocks for what made sense at the time. So the question is, how would we alter those to reflect some of the discussions we're having here? Because ultimately, as a public land manager and the mission of the Forest Service, I'm required to do multiple use. But multiple use, I mean, if you just use that term loosely, that means different things to different people. And even if you take the word recreation and how that's evolved from 1984 to what recreation looks like now, that continues to evolve. And so consequently, how the public is interacting with those public lands continues to change and evolve. So the new forest plan would have to probably do a better, would have to do a better job, would give us the opportunity to take a closer look at some of these high use areas and get back to a point that Marche had shared earlier in terms of, if you're trying to balance sustainability, conservation, and use, what's that carrying capacity, and what are the models? What do we use to define what that looks like? And how do we then take advantage of the technology? Maybe it is the cell phone, maybe it's something else. But the point is, I think we're going to have to start thinking in terms of how do we balance the uses in order to protect those range of values that we all agree. We all moved here because we love that backdrop. The question is, how do we sustain that backdrop into the future? My perspective in terms of, as a public land manager, and to use a very, very simplified analogy, my responsibility is, if the public lands are a motor or an engine, right? And I want to pass that to the next generation, I want to pass the whole motor over there with all the cogs and wheels and all the pulleys to make sure that they have and retain all the options to be able to run that motor in the future. That's kind of what our role is as public managers, is as we're doing these next phases of planning, how do we work, in this case, collaboratively with others? Because we're integrated in this landscape far more than probably we would have thought in the 80s, and certainly beyond or earlier than that. But I think what we've seen that has worked for us successfully here is that by better coordinating, better integrating our management across those boundaries, we're able to make better decisions, or at least more informed decisions in terms of how we strike that balance between sustainability and protecting those values, and still allowing for access and the amount of access and the type of access that our publics are asking for. So I think that's going to be the challenge. I'll use a very simplified example of things that we may have to think that are different. I'll use winter range for wildlife. In the past, ecologically, winter range is kind of where winter range is, where that habitat is. When I now look at it, and the discussions I have with my folks, is because my neighboring jurisdictions are starting to get pretty ingrown and populated, we may have to do on the Forest Service side, we may have to think about creating those wildlife habitats in a way that we wouldn't have had to do in the 80s, and certainly not before that. So those are the kind of discussions, that's the kind of dialogue we're going to have if we're going to try to balance the uses and the values and the conservation, and trying to find what that carrying capacity is relative to those range of values we're trying to protect.
Thanks, Oscar. Yeah, it's not an easy answer, is it? To just and one size doesn't fit all. Our challenges are unique to us in some ways, and then they're common in others. But our solutions have to be collaborative, like you've been saying, and working across jurisdictional boundaries as you have been. I think that's been great, and I think the multi-use plan was a good starting point for that. Susan, we're going to turn to you, and we know Ring the Peak is one example of an expanded outdoor recreation opportunity on the peak that came from the plan. But when you think about experiences that people want, examples of recreation assets or amenities, what would have merit today that you feel like we need to pursue, that people are asking for? As Oscar said, the way the public is engaging with the land is different today, but they still have those values and those things that they enjoy. So if you could point some of those out for us. Also, are there any untapped opportunities for citizen participation in improvement of the natural and recreational assets of the Pikes Peak region?
Great question, Becky. The plan pointed out that they wanted alternative routes. They wanted new portals, and a lot of that was created, which was so exciting. You hear clamoring for more, but then again, we have to balance that with what Oscar is talking about, is is really attending to all the needs and balancing that. Take the South Slope. The Trails and Open Space Coalition worked hard. My predecessor spent lots of times in meetings, as did many other people, to try to come up with a way to provide access to the South Slope after being closed for 100 years. And you look at what's there today, and I hope many of you do and have, because the trails are lovely, thanks to Friends of the Peak and Mary Berger, who helped design those. And the amenities are great parking lot. The fishing is superb from what I understand. But it's underutilized. If you look, the city has put into the system a way for people to access that resource, and yet it is tremendously underutilized. And so certainly it is a distance, but that was something the community wanted, but then the community isn't using. So it's something to consider. We hear that once the Ring the Peak Trail is finished, how wonderful would it be to have some kind of a hut-to-hut system like you find on the Colorado Trail or other world-class destinations, and we'd be all about that. But how does that get done? When I read the multi-use plan and see that out of the confidence survey, they said that 85% of the participants that put all those hours into that effort said that they would come back and step forward again to help with sort of stage 2. And that to me is one of the most exciting pieces of the plan, that, when this community is asked to step up and mull over these difficult questions, they're willing to put in the time. And so I think we're going to need to draw on that again and take the multi-plan forward and come up with it in today and kind of come up with how do we take that ahead. So anyway, that's what I want to share. And I do think that's one of the most exciting pieces of the plan.
Thanks so much, Susan. Appreciate that perspective. We're going to just move right along. I'm watching the time here a little bit. I have a question that first we're going to send it to Oscar and then over to Mark. So I'd like both of you to comment on this if you would. In regard to management strategy, the plan indicates that the recommended management structure for the Pikes Peak multi-use plan is a composite of the cooperative management agreement, independent, and nonprofit models. So the plan ended up with basically the independent model as a loose guide to land managers or aspirational guide to land managers. How have the Forest Service and Colorado Springs Utilities viewed the plan in terms of determining priorities and decision making? And is there room for further collaboration of the management of resources as well as the management of recreation that's described in this plan? Oscar, you first, and then Mark, you can tag along after him.
No, thanks. Well, I referenced it earlier. I would say we did end up with the independent model, which, I think in some respects maybe ended up being what made sense because of the other additional steps we all had to do in regard, or depending on the agency you were looking at it from in terms of implementing. That said, like I shared earlier, we certainly from the U.S. Forest Service side have continued to engage on trying to get some of the recreational amenities, some of those agreed to projects in place and kind of moving those forward. But as I mentioned earlier, the Forest Service and utilities in particular, we've had this longstanding cooperative agreement to work on those watershed areas that Mark was alluding to that date back to the 1913s. And so that process, I think, was accelerated as a byproduct of the multi-use plan. And we routinely get together and discuss within the greater Catamount. We started in the greater Catamount area of treating additional acres both on utilities lands, but also on the Forest Service side to augment and improve, if you would, the watershed health and the forest health in those areas. That didn't stay right there, though. That concept has actually been extended for the greater Rampart Range, and most of the Pikes Peak District now has some degree of agreements either directly with utilities or other partners that have come to the table to help us manage it on a landscape scale. Those to me are kind of byproducts of how we prioritize. It's this thing where we have to kind of walk and chew gum at the same time. We can still do the recreational elements that are part of this, but as a forest land manager where multiple uses are a requirement, I'm also having to have discussions with utilities for how we manage the priority concerns that they have within their watersheds. We can do both. And so I think the benefit of this is that it's created an additional set of partnerships that are facilitated by the dialogue that the multi-use plan, but maybe has given us the freedom to go and focus more specifically on individual tasks that we want to do relative to, say, vegetation management.
Thanks, Oscar. Mark, your perspective?
I guess the only thing that I would add to Oscar's answer is, the multi-use plan reflected shared values, a kind of a nascent understanding and recognition that we have overlapping interests on the landscape and at a landscape scale, that there's the need to manage and protect those values and interests collaboratively. And, through partnerships that we've had that I think actually, really reflect more of a cooperative approach to landscape management with the U.S. Forest Service, with Colorado Springs Parks, with some of our other communities within the region. I think we have a strong foundation that has been supported by the Pikes Peak Multi-Use Plan. And I think that there is a lot more opportunity to continue to build in collaborative efforts to, more effectively and sustainably manage this landscape that's so precious to us in so many different ways.
Thank you, Mark and Oscar. Yeah, I think that's great for us to hear that maybe it was an impetus for some further agreements and cooperation between Colorado Springs Utilities and the Forest Service and additional partners and land managers who have overlapping jurisdictions or that butt up against one another. So thank you for that. The next question is going to go to David Lineweber. And the question is, there's one elephant in the room when it comes to managing recreation at its current level, let alone growing recreational assets and amenities such as are in the regional vision plan of this multi-use plan. And that is the need for additional and sustainable funding. We know that our land managers are consistently underfunded and understaffed. Can you share with us some of the discussions happening around funding and how and why the public needs to get engaged? And I know this is a big question and we're only probably going to touch the tip of the iceberg here, but I think it's important to us engage around the question of funding.
Well, thanks, Becky. I think there's really two aspects. There's kind of the one and done funding, which is, and my favorite example, if you've gotten to know me, is the bathroom issue. We often can get funding to build a bathroom, and we can do that through grants and other types of programs. But the real challenge is who's going to clean the bathroom and who's going to put toilet paper in the bathroom and who's going to fix the curb and who's going to, and it's the maintenance issue. And those, it's kind of the sustainable funding that we haven't quite captured yet. And that's where I think the biggest challenge is. So you have to kind of first realize that there's kind of these two different things that can kind of go. We can raise money, for example, to build a summit house and get grants and other things to kind of go with this. And we're doing that pretty successfully right now. But the other piece is that we have to come up with the sustainability funding that really kind of helps. And so there's different ideas that are kind of out there. One is that we can raise local taxes, and our community isn't typically very popular when it wants to start a talk about raising sales tax, for example. Or developing a hiking boot tax has kind of gone around. The other piece that's probably going to get more traction, and we're going to see more and more, is this whole pay-to-play aspect. It's a strategy where it actually taxes the user directly with a user fee or something along those lines. And I think that's primarily where the direction we're going to be probably heading. And we're going to need community and engagement and kind of defining what that might look like. And then we also have this aspect of getting someone else to pay for it. I mean, we want Santa Claus to show up, right? And there might be an element of that in the discussion of making Pikes Peak a national park. And obviously getting a different type of revenue source, or a state park, or a city park, possibly creating a Pikes Peak recreation area where it defines a recreation district per se. I mean, there's a lot of these type of things that are kind of being thrown around, and but with handing over that to an agency, the pay-to-play model is going to be coming into it to kind of be a component to help offset costs. And we're starting to see that kind of already happen. A neighboring forest district, the South Platte Ranger District, for example, just recently announced that they're going to take 340 free dispersed camping sites and convert them into a reservation system and attach fees. So there's going to be new fees to all of these camping sites. At the same time, they will be adding fire rings and toilets, which are really kind of necessary with all the additional use that we're getting. So this is just one type of pay to play, but there's going to have to be some engagement. No plan goes anywhere without sustainable funding. And I think possibly that was one of the biggest things that the plan never realized, is how do we make this thing happen? Becky?
Okay, thank you, David. Appreciate that perspective. And as you've heard throughout this, there are conversations going on. There are a lot of us trying to dig in and find solutions. And there will be opportunities for public engagement all along this process, because I don't think today ends with just a discussion about where we were, but obviously we want to talk about where we want to go. The next question I think is going to be important as we think about the future. And this one we'd really love to have everybody's perspective on. So we're going to do a little bit of a round robin. And the question is, and we'll just do 1 minute each. We'll try to keep it concise. But how can we ensure in our future planning efforts that Pikes Peak public lands are more accessible to multiple user groups, as well as previously disengaged demographics? Jeff, we'll start with you. Can you give us your input on that?
Oh, what a pleasant surprise to start with me, Becky. I think I'll yield the balance of my time to Oscar and then to the exchange. But based on that question and following Sharon Boyd and some of the conversation in the chat room, something we can all unify and work together on is continuing to elevate the land ethic of forest users that come into the environment. Thank you.
Definitely. Well, that was great. Thank you. Very concise. And you're very right. That stewardship and those ethics are very key. All right. Susan, let's take you. What's your thoughts on that?
On access. Okay. Several of us were part of a recent process to talk about access and future challenges. And one of the interesting points that came out of all that was the need for transportation, that we're going to need to figure out, and we're already seeing this in the city, where so many people are getting out to use our parks, trails, and open spaces, as they should, because it is truly one of the most healthy places we can be for mental and physical health. Nevertheless, it's created challenges with parking. Parking lots are overflowing, and we'll never be able to build our way out of that completely. So I think we're going to have to get creative about how do we get people who may not have access to the peak and to some of its assets up there, and what does that look like, and get creative with that, but certainly focusing on transportation options to address that problem. Back to you.
Thanks, Susan. Yeah, for those of you who don't know, Susan and a few of us participated in a futuring exercise with the Forest Service that came through NOCO places in northern Colorado. They're trying to address some of these same challenges, and transportation came up in that conversation for sure, as it has in many others. David, let's take you. What are your thoughts on access?
Well, I think a big thing that we need to realize is that we have a different population group, and they have different needs than what we kind of envision how we use the forest and how we do outdoor activities. And I'll give you just a quick example and then move on. The Hispanic community, for example, loves to get together in groups. They love to do big picnics or big groups and get family together and all of that. And right now, we don't really accommodate that very well. And we need to kind of think about how we might be able to build things into our systems or our new plan as this kind of develops that accommodates some of the ways that people and different groups do enjoy using the outdoors. Thanks.
Thanks, David. Mark, how about you?
Well, thank you. this is a little bit outside of Colorado Springs Utilities area of responsibility, but I guess I would focus on the point that's been made a couple of times through our discussions so far this morning, and that is the sustainability of the existing access that we have, and assuring that as we grow access in different places for different user groups, that we ensure that we have resources in place to manage those uses sustainably, both in the development of the amenities that are necessary for those uses, but then also for the longer term management, maintenance, repair, and just assuring that the greater access doesn't contribute to the impacts on the landscape long term.
Thanks, Mark. Appreciate that. All right, Oscar, you're going to round it out for us for this question.
Thanks. So I thought of access in a couple of different ways. There's certainly access of how do you get there. And I think that's kind of what Susan was addressing. I think she's absolutely right. We're going to have to, if we're going to protect some of the values out there, the question becomes at what point do we continue to access it the same ways we always have? And I think at some point we will be faced with a decision that we need to find different and better or different ways to get there, but still have access. That's one level of access. I think the other part of access for me, and it gets at the larger demographic discussion, is our demographics are changing. And our demographics on the Front Range of Colorado are changing rapidly. And so we will always be challenged with trying to keep up with how those change. But the point is that it's changing. And that requires some sort of equity. We're going to have to take the opportunity to reach out to those communities that maybe haven't been as engaged in these dialogues. And I would use our tribal nations as a good example of that. I can say, I can safely say that the discussion we had with the Summit Complex and how that went, that's probably the most engaged that I've seen our Native tribes on a topic that's very specific to here. And most of those folks don't necessarily live here locally, but there's a greater responsibility, I think, on the agencies that are involved to make that effort, to take the time to do that. There's always, and there's a tension here between trying to get it done and get it done quickly, and then how do you have the conversations you need to have, and how do you give folks enough time to be able to weigh in on those discussions? And I think that's going to be the challenge for us, is how do we expand the table to include more of those folks? We certainly can do a lot better than we have in the past. I think we've done a lot in the last few years to get even better than we have been. But I think we'll be challenged by that, but I think we need to continue to do that and take the time to do that.
Thanks, Oscar. And thanks for all of you panelists in addressing that question. And it's a really broad question. And I know we just took the tip of the iceberg for each of you to answer kind of a piece of it. But that's the kind of thing we need to continue to engage around, trying to get more equitable user group involvement, as well as the demographics. And this is part of, as things change, we need to be engaging all of these folks in the process as best we can. So thank you all for your viewpoint. I know that this is something that we're all going to continue to be talking about and weighing in on. One of the things that came through audience questions this morning that I really think we need to put on the table, and it's certainly fresh in a lot of our minds, and that is wildfires. This morning I've been texting my sister-in-law and my daughter because we have a family cabin that is potentially in the line of a fire. I know another person on our group here is in the same boat. Wildfires are a big challenge. Our community knows what that's like. And I don't have my video on, just realized that, sorry. Our community has certainly been affected by wildfires in the past. And one of the things that we had a questioner ask about, and I'll throw this back to you, Oscar, what is built into the plan with regards to fire prevention and mitigation? And I'll add on to that, what are we doing maybe after the plan in terms of prevention and mitigation, things we've learned, lessons we've learned, and things we're applying?
So the multi-use plan didn't go into a lot of detail relative to fire. I think that's one of the things that we talked about. But here's what it did do, and I think this is where it's important, is that it did lead to a strengthening of the partnerships that we have with Colorado Springs Utilities. So for that larger, greater Catamount area, Colorado Springs Utilities and the Forest Service got together and we looked at that entire landscape to say, what are the things that we can do now to start changing the way fire moves across that landscape? And those efforts are at least 10 years old. And that partnership has been renewed to kind of refocus. You know, you use the science at the time of when you make those decisions, but it evolves, right? So we're going back and revisiting some of those areas where we've done a lot of work. Most of you that have been up the Pikes Peak Highway, you've seen the benefit and the outcome of some of those efforts where we've done work along the Pikes Peak Highway, but it's not just along the Pikes Peak Highway. We've done work off the ridges and other places that it made sense to do that. Now you prioritize the work based on the dollars and the opportunities you have, but you try to do it strategically. So I would say overall, we've made an effort to start to make a difference on the fireshed or watershed or forest health perspective of trying to do work out there separate and above, but it's a byproduct of the relationship. It's the byproduct of the understanding and that point that Mark has shared previously of shared values, understanding that it's in our both interests to work together to continue to do that, to accelerate that to the extent that we can.
Thank you, Oscar. I appreciate that. One of the other questions that came through, and actually I'm going to, Karen, if you're still there, I'm going to actually throw this one over to you. And that is regarding leave no trace. So we've talked a little bit about the ethics. We've seen pictures of what's happening out there today and the challenges that we have on all of our public lands with making sure that we have good outdoor ethics exercised. There have been some efforts regarding leave no trace in the state, at the state level. Certainly we know the office, the Colorado Tourism Office has partnered with Leave No Trace. And they have a Care for Colorado coalition. There's also Recreate Responsibly Colorado, another coalition out of the Outdoor Recreation Industry Office. We know that these values are important, but we'd love to hear a little bit about, what are we doing as far as implementing Leave No Trace or other outdoor ethics here on our public lands. And Karen, if you're still there, can you pop on and I'd like to have you address that.
Hi, Becky. Yes, of course I'm still here. Can everybody see my video? I just wanted to mention, I think Sharon Boyd, who is in the audience today, had asked this question in terms of what we are doing. And for the city of Colorado Springs, Jillian Rossi, who's our ranger supervisor, has really integrated Leave No Trace into just about everything she and her team are doing throughout our organization. We are currently on track for all of our regional facilities to reach that gold standard in 2021 for all of our park facilities, which was a huge lift to move through all of our parks, but she's done an amazing job. They've done a lot of training. We've integrated that into all of our staff training now as well. And thanks to our volunteer Parks, Recreation, and Cultural Services Advisory Board, who just approved our wayfinding packages, the Leave No Trace messages and principles will all be integrated into those signage packages that you'll start to see in our open spaces. And I believe we're starting with Blodgett Peak first. So take a peek at that if you get a chance to get out there once those signs are installed, and give us some feedback. We'd love to hear how that is working, and appreciate everybody's efforts, and especially Jillian for leading that charge for our organization.
Thank you, Karen. Appreciate that. All right, we only have a couple of minutes left, but I do want to address this last one, which I think is pretty important. We've kind of worked around it, and that is, are there plans to update the multi-use plan? And if not, how should we proceed? So I would love to let's do, gosh, we only have a minute. I'm going to throw this to David Lineweber. If you want to address where we're at with updating the multi-use plan, if that's in the cards in the future, or what next steps people can get involved in.
Well, that's part of what this discussion is. Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance has kind of, over the last year, been kind of looking at all these challenges and where are we at on this plan? And so we have been gathering with different participants in what we call our PPORA Advisory Council, and they've been engaging with ideas and thoughts and how do we move forward and all that, those pieces. Everyone that has talked today has been engaging with the idea. We know we have a plan that is dated. We know that we need a plan to move forward. There are, as we've discussed today, there's a lot of different aspects that we need to address that are new, that weren't realities in Y2K era. And so I think the path forward isn't clearly defined, but we're starting to kind of put ideas together. And so we're looking for people to kind of start to engage. And I think we're going to start seeing Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation is going to kind of take the lead on that community engagement piece. And so if you're interested, certainly reach out and contact Becky Langweber and just Becky at ppora.org and say you want to participate and what group you're from or whatever it might be. We're going to see kind of these kind of things kind of happening. I have heard on the horizon that the Heritage Series is possibly going to take up the whole conversation of pay to play and what that looks like. And so the community is talking about it, but there's not any boots on the ground yet for what's going to happen here. But the other piece is that I know at some point the Pikes Peak Forest will be addressing their forest plan. And I know Oscar has really wanted to kind of get ahead of that. And so I think we're going to see some movement pretty quick.
Thank you, David. And that actually sets up our closing with Walt Heacock. So Walt is going to share with us a little bit about where we go from here. So Walt, you are up. I think they're booting up the slides here, so it'll be just a moment. And then we'll hear from Walt. All right. Walt, are you there now? Fellows, if you could unmute Walt. There we go.
Okay, I hope everybody can hear me. You can't see me with my video right now, I guess. Can somebody give me a signal you're hearing my voice?
We're hearing you, and actually we can see your video, but you need to angle it a little bit so we see your whole head.
The camera's not.
Up almost, a little bit more.
I can see nothing on my camera, sorry.
Lower it just a tad.
Anyway, let's go ahead. On behalf of El Pomar Foundation, I want to thank all of our participants, Karen, Susan, Jeff, David, Oscar, Mark, and our moderator, Becky. As is our process, we plan a year ahead, and a year ago, El Pomar Heritage Series started talking about 2020, and a celebration of the multi-use plan was at the top, and here we are. We've celebrated and we are celebrating its accomplishments and how dramatically the region has grown. I'll mention a bit of that in a minute. The 6 land managers associated with the Pikes Peak region take us beyond with Forest Service. We spent a lot of time because they're a central player. And we've discussed coming together as a planning process. I wanted to share with you just a bit about how the region has evolved. So if you could change the slide, please. Under the multi-use plan, you've seen what we've accomplished. And I wanted to compare that with what Oscar mentioned and some discussion about the forest plan. So the next slide, please. The 1999 plan, the 1984 plan actually was up for revision in 1999, and work went on till 2005 with some delay. And then when the spotted owl issue came along in 2009, national court decisions negated any new planning. So we still have the same plan, but we've amended it, as Oscar mentioned, and that will continue. Of importance, though, is that we are the oldest existing forest plan in the U.S. Forest Service Region 2. And so that may well tell us that we need to consider some changes. For instance, the three-county Pikes Peak region has more than doubled from 384,000 in 1983 to 793,000 in 2019. 71% of Colorado residents participate in outdoor recreation. We have 23 million visitors. Tourism is our third largest employer and supporting some 20,000 jobs. And as David mentioned, our renowned quality of life is vitally linked with the outdoors. All of these provide huge challenges to those who manage the outdoors, and we've heard about it. Next slide, please. The forest plan was created as what many have said was a quasi-rural area, a rural plan, emphasis on multi-use resource extraction. Of note, when it was created in 1984, Colorado Springs was all of 250,000 people. Today's urgent public lands issues, really many were not on the radar screen, including the wildland-urban interface, climate change impacts on drought and vegetation, and we are seeing that tragically today across Colorado with the massive fires. We've had 3 in our region, and seems like every week or month we have a fire that's now the largest in Colorado. The revolution in mobility is affecting our roads, trails, and so forth. During 1980s, people used hiking, horseback, and some four-wheel drive vehicles. Now we've added ATVs, more powerful rough terrain vehicles, electric bikes. I'm sure more will come. Organized and informal dispersed camping has exploded, and we've talked some about that. And the pressure for hunting and shooting causes conflicts with those who want to camp and hike. So in ending, we come back to the broad landscape scale view, the vision of the multi-use plan, which is now 20 years old, and was built on a broad community and stakeholder participation. Where next? Even as we celebrate what we've accomplished from that plan, it's time now to think about where we go next. I would just mention that we've talked about a revision of the forest plan. The current administration is now caught up with the issue of revisions of plans in NEPA. That's being dramatically changed, and there may be another administration. The planning environment may change as fast as the nature that we try to plan. Of note, it takes a minimum of 3 years to revise a plan, and a lot of money, several $1 million. So we might want to think about how we make a revision of the multi-use plan way to jumpstart whatever comes next on a forest plan and the broader planning of the Division of Wildlife and BLM and so forth. And in doing that, I think we need to back up and be realistic. Colorado Springs has a strong military dimension in no small measure due to decades-long effective and powerful planning and involvement by a variety of groups and a military affairs council through the chamber. We can do likewise for our outdoors, seeking direction, help from the Chamber of Commerce, and our elected officials need to be much more engaged. And PPORA is already beginning that process and doing an incredibly active and inclusive job. So I want to thank everybody for today's celebration. Ella Pomar is thinking about 2021, and as David mentioned, the pressure on the forests and the growth and the COVID lead to pay to play, to massive overuse of our resources to queuing and other ways that we might moderate the demand to fit sustainability. So we hope we'll pick up that topic. We would encourage any of you who have topics that you think the Heritage Series should be involved in to send them along. And with that, I want to turn it over to Sam Hinckley, who is an LPMR program associate, who will wind this up, I believe, with a promise of some refreshment.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Walt, for that insight. I want to make sure everybody can see or hear me. If I could just get a quick indicator on that.
Yes.
Am I coming? Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Just wanted to double check on that. Again, thank you, Walt, for that insight and for your guidance and leadership in preparing today's event. It's been wonderful working with you. As Walt said, my name is Sam Hinkle. I am a second-year fellow supporting the Heritage Series at LPMR Foundation. And I have the opportunity and the privilege to work to help prepare events like the one today. I get to work with some pretty incredible people, like our other fellows on this program, Claire, our second-year fellow, and Alex and Matt, who have been all behind the scenes getting this going. Of course, gotta thank Mr. Tutt and Erica for their leadership in planning today's event as well. They're wonderful people to work with. And got to give another huge shout out to our panelists and our introductory speaker, Karen. Thank you so much for sharing your insight and your expertise with us today. We have a couple of partners that we should definitely acknowledge in terms of preparing today's event. The Trails and Open Space Coalition and Pikes Peak Outdoor Recreation Alliance. Not only have Becky and Susan been tremendous partners and participants in today's event as a moderator and a panelist, but they've also been central to the planning process, and we really appreciate the opportunity to work with them and all of their hard work on getting today's event going. We also want to thank one more partner that hasn't been mentioned yet, and that is the Fountain Creek Brewshed Alliance, which is a program of the Fountain Creek Watershed Flood Control and Greenway District. This is a program that partners with institutions across the city for the education about and protection of our watersheds in the Pikes Peak region. And they've partnered with us today to provide some refreshments because we can't really cater a webinar event. They've been wonderful in helping us kind of find substitutes for that. So over the next week, if you go to this list of participating institutions that I will be listing off here in just a second, in the next week with the passphrase, you will get $5 off your purchase at these institutions. That passphrase is coming. Stay tuned. The list of participating institutions you can go to as a function of the Fountain Creek Brewshed Alliance's partnership with us today are in no particular order: Goat Patch Brewing, Red Leg Brewing, Bristol Brewery, Phantom Canyon, Storybook Brewing, Local Relic, Colorado Mountain Brewery, both the north and south locations, the Peaks and Pines breweries, both the Colorado Springs and Fountain locations, Brass Brewing, and Atravita. And all you have to do is give this passphrase at your purchase. Say that you went to today's event and give the passphrase that's in the chat. That phrase is the best drops for your hops. If you give that code while purchasing at any of these institutions, in the next week, they will give you $5 off any purchase of food or beverage. Now, there are limited resources for this project here. So if you go to one of these breweries and cannot get the discount because their resources have all been run out, the benefit of that list is its length. There's 11 other breweries on that list. Go ahead and try out another one, spread the love there. Again, that code that's active for the next week is best drops for your hops. The Heritage Series team will be following up today's event with an email that will answer any questions that were asked either through email or through the chat today and we were unable to answer during today's program. We will also be posting the recorded version of today's event. So if you have any friends or family who you think would be interested but were unable to attend today, you can direct them to that resource. That will all be contained in our email follow-up. Once more, thank you all for being here today, panelists, partners, and attendees, and for your participation in questions. We look forward to seeing you at future events. With that, we are adjourned. Thank you so much, everybody.